Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the 2020 Bibliometrics and Research Assessment Symposium. My name is Chris Belter, and along with my colleague Yaling Liu, I'm one of the event co-hosts for our sessions today. Before we get started, I do have a couple of quick reminders for folks, just in case anybody has joined us. We are recording the session, but we're not recording either the attendees or the chat, so feel free to continue participating in the event without worrying about you becoming part of our recordings. Audio for all attendees is in broadcast only, so you don't need to join the audio sessions, but all attendees are going to be muted and will remain muted throughout the session. So please use the chat box to get in touch with us. You can send questions for the speakers, you can send questions about technical issues, or just have general conversations. Please use that in the chat box and send all of your messages to everyone. We do have folks monitoring the chat, so please send those messages to everyone so that we can see them and we can route them appropriately. Finally, we do have live captions available in the multimedia viewer panel and in the URL that was just shared in the chat. So with that, we're going to go ahead and kick off our next panel session. And this panel session is going to be all about the meaning of citations and what it is that we're actually measuring when we're counting citations. So up first is Misha Teplitskiy from the University of Michigan and Harvard University to talk about a survey that they've done for authors of their motivations for citing articles. So Misha? And remember to unmute.
Okay. Can you guys hear me now?
There you go. Yep.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks a bunch, Chris and Yaling, for organizing the symposium. I'm excited to share this work with you guys. It's a work in progress, so I'm looking forward to your comments and sort of playing with ideas together. So this talk, as Chris said, I'm Misha Teplitskiy. I'm at U of M School of Info. There's my Eamon on Twitter. So this talk is about how we cite and the role of status in that process. This is a team effort, very much so, with colleagues from University of Chicago and Harvard. So to kick things off, I'll pose the following background. The reason sort of we're all brought to this, the reason bringing us to the symposium is that, we all use bibliometrics and citations widely. Generally, we do that to measure influence of research papers. Here, I'll be defining influence in a somewhat narrow, but I think reasonable way. Influence is when you change your research choices based on something you read, right? Maybe there's other kinds of influence you can think of, but this seems important in type, so we'll focus on that. And with that definition, the literature generally shows not all citations have this kind of influence or influence at all. Some are, setting the context for our claims. Some might even be coercive. So the actual influence of different citations we make really varies. And so research shows that only some, in fact, like relatively few citations really carry a lot of influence. A lot of them are more symbolic in nature. So the question we're going to pose here is which papers attract this kind of high influence denoting citations or the more symbolic low influence type, and why? And who cares about this? So I would say there's two reasons to care. One is that, we really do care about influence, and so kind of factoring out the citations that don't confer influence gives us better measures. And we also want to understand better the role of a quality of a paper and its recognition for, to understand careers and things like that. So the question we're going to pose and answer in this presentation is, what is the role of a paper's status and how it is cited? And status, we mean here position relative to others. In our case, it'll be like citation counts or percentiles. You have some famous papers, some obscure papers, so different status. So when we think about status and its role in the citing process, we might begin with something like this. We have a set of relevant papers. We have a academic, maybe it's Einstein or maybe it's me or you, and we're making, we're filling our reference lists in our paper with some of these relevant papers. Lots of research on the citing process showing that it's very varied, and I think there's no real clear kind of easy model for it. The step we're going to take is to split this up into two separate processes because we have two separate kinds of citations we're distinguishing now. So rather than looking at our reference list as a sort of what moves things from relevant to the reference list, we're going to have two different lists, one for papers that actually influence us a lot, and others that we use for more low influence kind of rhetorical purposes. And, the processes driving citations from one to the other might be somewhat different, right? For sort of the canonical kind of high influence view of citing, something's called the normative process. Quality is really key. We're influenced by high quality papers. We read them carefully. We presumably discover them in time, and so there's these kind of practical factors also, like when we discover and how carefully we read, and eventually those things that influence us we cite, right? The social constructivist process is, I think, less clearly articulated in the literature, but broadly, I think it has to do with rhetorical value, like what kinds of papers help us make our claims. We don't need to discover them early. We don't need to read them carefully even. It's all about sort of rhetorical value. And so the question is, what role does status play in both of these processes, and how might they aggregate together? And so of those two hypotheses, one I think is very common and actually drove my interest in this project, and that's going to be hypothesis one. I'm going to call it the vanity journals hypothesis, although, I'm shopping for names. But broadly, it says that, a journal paper status really varies, but it's kind of not that related to quality. You can find good quality work in obscure journals, obscure papers, the famous ones. You can find good work anywhere. Well, and that means that I can be influenced by papers from anywhere, whether they're obscure or prominent. And so, however, for my low influence citations, for the sort of social constructivist process, there I really do want to be citing famous papers. Those help me make the narrative, right? I don't want to be citing obscure papers because they don't give my claims as much weight. And so according to this view, famous papers should attract some kind of influential citations, but also a bunch of kind of symbolic citations, right? And that means that on average, they're going to have less meaningful citations. That I think is and you guys can tell me if I'm wrong, but that's my sense. That's kind of how most people think. That's certainly how I used to think. An alternative hypothesis says that, quality and status are actually pretty tightly related. And so you're going to be wanting to cite famous papers both because they're better and because they're high status. However, and it's kind of an empirical question, the bar for citing for something that actually influenced you, it's, a pretty big investment. You got to read it, you got to discover it early enough. Whether citing something symbolically presumably has a lower bar. Furthermore, there's a kind of mechanical point that, when it comes to influence, you actually might be nudged to prefer high status papers from purely kind of practical considerations. If you see something kind of famous, you might think it's better, so you'll read it more carefully. If you think something is famous, you might share it with your colleagues, in which case they'll discover the paper earlier and be more potential to be influenced by them. And so according to this hypothesis, famous papers should actually attract more influential citations on average, and it's the obscure papers that are going to be cited sort of kind of less meaningfully. So these are the two hypotheses we have in mind, and we're going to test them. And I think we're going to test them pretty conclusively, pretty well. So this was done with a huge survey of scientists from all kind of corners of academia. I'm going to skip the particulars of how the sampling went because it's sort of elaborate, but we partnered with Web of Science, systematically sampled people across fields, asked each of them about two specific references they made in their papers. And so the authors label for us what the citations meant to them. and sort of how they discovered them, how closely they read them, etc. In this survey, we're also going to embed an experiment, which will tell us how citations and sort of status actually affects perceptions of quality. So we fielded the survey. I frankly didn't expect this to go well, just because like who answers email surveys these days, right? Like I certainly don't. And so I was honestly kind of shocked to discover how well this went. So we sent out, almost 70K emails, got actually a bit more than I'm showing here, almost like 10,000 responses. Each person that responded rated or kind of described two of their citing decisions. And we got, in the end, about like a 15%, 14% completion rate. So overall, honestly, a pretty surprising amount of response and data that came in. I was very pleased with that. So jumping into the results, what did we find? So first, kind of matching previous literature to some extent, we find that, most citations don't mean all that much. So if we use the scale that I have here in panel A, we had a scale that went from 1 to 5. 1, which is basically the reference is kind of purely kind of superficial. 5 is it's super important, motivated my entire project. We see that it shares a lot of 1s and 2s. In fact, 54%. So most citations authors tell us didn't really influence them much, if at all. On panel B here shows how that varies across fields. We see that the median, sort of the black bar, is almost for every field, the median citation is sort of only has minor influence. There are some cross-field differences, but they're actually not that big. So broadly, we conclude that across fields, citing cultures are, of course, vary, but on this, sort of how influential these citations are, they don't vary a ton. And here is sort of the key kind of graph. And this is kind of undermining my expectation going in. On the x-axis, we have the status of the paper, how many citations it has, and the logs. On the y-axis is how influential its citations are. And what we clearly see is that the more famous the paper, the more meaningful are its citations. The more influence they actually confer, the more research choices they change. That varies across kind of fields or kind of categories somewhat. It's especially high in arts and humanities, but broadly across all fields except maybe kind of clinical research, the more famous the paper in somebody's reference list, the more it actually, not less, but the more influential it probably was on that citing person. We can now try to understand why that happens. And so we look at how people discovered the reference, how closely they read it. What we see here in panel A is that, again, same x-axis, paper status, namely the citations. It's the same x-axis for all the graphs, all the panels. And so first we see that if we kind of number stages in a project from 1 to 5, papers that are more famous are discovered earlier. That's panel A. Panel B shows us that they're discovered more often through sharing between colleagues, through social contact, whereas obscure papers are generally kind of discovered just through a database search. We see that famous papers are considered to be better across all sorts of quality dimensions. And as we kind of saw previously, but now adding the knowledge or kind of reading level, we see that famous papers are read more closely. Obscure papers, on the other hand, are read only superficially and end up having superficial influence. Lastly, I'm going to try to show that some of this relationship between status and citation use is causal. So in the survey, we had an embedded experiment. So 15%, so 85% of people got the standard form, the control form. We just kind of started with like, here's what you cited. Do you remember this reference? Tell us about it. And then some people got the treatment form, which was exactly the same, except it would remind people how often the paper has been cited and how well it ranks among papers in the field. And I hope the fonts are big enough for you guys to see where the status signal, where the real treatment comes in. What effects did this treatment have? Well, the treatment basically helped amplify existing quality differences, exaggerating them. So in the panel A shows the citation percentile of paper and how it was perceived on overall quality for people who got the treatment and those who didn't. And we see that, of course, the treatment control shows way bigger difference between papers on quality than those people received without that signal. And we see that effect for kind of all the dimensions of quality, basically, that the more highly cited the paper, if we kind of remind you that it's highly cited, you'll think it's relatively better, more valid, but validity is actually not so much, but more significant, more novel, more generalizable, roughly speaking. So papers that are low citations are really penalized in how people perceive their quality. And now we jump to the last slide on the conclusions. So what did we learn here? So we asked the question, what was the role of paper status and how cited? And I think we got a pretty clear answer. Then high status papers are cited 2 to 3 times more meaningfully, by which I mean they are cited in a way that actually denotes influence, actually acknowledges intellectual depth. And so that implies that, citations we often take as a kind of proxy, hopefully unbiased proxy of influence. We show that if we disaggregate citations into those that are actually influence denoting and those that aren't, we see that this equality breaks down. The famous papers are actually driving science more than their citation count suggests. And obscure papers are actually even less influential than their citations. They're cited much more symbolically than others. We also see, going into mechanisms that the bar for citing something symbolically is actually pretty low. People don't read those papers carefully. They're generally not high status. They're not perceived as high quality, but people still cite them. The link that we discovered here between status and influence is likely causal, as shown by our experiments. That means it's above how high status, low status something is can actually create differences in influence regardless of its quality. So this is above and beyond quality differences. The link is a bit complicated, and we don't see, of course, in our project the entire process, but we do see the first part, that high status does give you better perceptions, and better perceptions presumably then affects the influence pipeline. And so overall, we conclude that, quality is still crucial here, but status actually amplifies the quality differences. And I believe I'm running out of time, so I'll stop there, and thank you very much.
Misha, you're actually right on time. We have some really interesting comments in the thread, but they're not really questions. So I'm just going to leave them to you to look at and read. Thank you again.
Okay. Yeah. So I'm reading. I'll read out loud. Gotta have money to make money applies to citation status. Yep. Agreed. This is interesting. Agreed. So high status paper for us is, we measure it in 2 ways. It's just how many citations you have, but also your citation percentile. So you either operationalization gives the same findings. Rhetorical value versus normative. So rhetorical, I'm kind of with language here, but we're basically distinguishing between high influence citations that actually change your research choices and low influence citations that have other purposes. And it's that latter category that I call rhetorical.
Thank you once again, Misha. That was great. Thank you for a great presentation.
Yeah, thanks much, everybody.
So up next is in our panel session is Josh Nicholson from Scite, who's going to be talking about an AI approach that he and his team are taking to address some of the similar kinds of questions. So Josh?
Great. Thanks for the opportunity to give this talk today, and for the great talks the previous 2 days. I'll give a little bit of a backstory on the founding story of Scite and what led me to go from my day-to-day looking at chromosomes to really looking at citations. And so about 5 years ago, I was doing a PhD in cell biology, and I was spending my days taking images like this, looking at how cancer cells divide. Around this time, a pretty seminal paper came out in Nature from Begley and Ellis, looking at how reproducible cancer research was, and they found to be not very reproducible at all. And so this got a lot of attention in the popular press as well as within the scientific community, and really kind of piqued my interest a lot, because I think, you know, if you can't reproduce the study, that is a big cost, both in terms of money, but also in terms of people's times and ultimately people's lives if you're talking about cancer research. And so I took, you know, kind of a typical academic approach back then and wrote a paper suggesting a potential solution. And this potential solution was basically saying, we don't love metrics as researchers, but we also don't see them going away, so maybe we should try to improve upon them. And we were trying to introduce this R factor. And the R factor in this idea is really kind of the genesis of the idea behind CITE. And essentially what it is looking at is, instead of just the count of citations, how many of those actually support the claim that is being made in this, and then how many of them dispute it in a simple ratio. And so it's kind of funny because in this paper, I didn't think that we could actually do it. And we suggest that Elsevier or Thomson Reuters or NCBI or someone else should take on this challenge. Over the years, we kind of spent on the side actually toying with this, and we've now, you know, gone from analyzing hundreds of citations manually to hundreds of millions with the launch of CITE. And so CITE is, I think, the best way to show this, you know, really aimed at making science more reliable. And so not just focusing on impact or the count of citations, but really the quality of them. And so I think the best way to look at this is to look at the world as it exists without CITE, and then to look at it as it exists through the lens of CITE. And so to continue upon the narrative of looking at my own research, you can see that I published in eLife. I did my PhD at Virginia Tech. We collaborated with the hospital in Portugal as well as the lab at the NIH. It's been cited 40 times, and then now actually viewed over 7,000 times, because I give this talk quite a bit, so I'm gaming that up. And so this is one way of looking at a publication, or what I think we all kind of do. Where is it published? Who are the authors? What are their affiliations? And then some metrics. And what we really want to change is this citation number. And so instead of just looking at that and saying high, good, low, bad, we really want people to be able to take away information from that that could change how they interpret this scientific article. And so in today's world, if you click that number, you might come over to Scopus or Web of Science, and you'll see a list of articles. And so these articles are by definition directly relevant to the article of interest, but to understand what they're saying about this article of interest would require a massive amount of work. You'd have to open all of them, find where the in-text citation is, and then see what are they saying. And so I would say that most people, when they come to a scientific publication, are not looking at all the citations, especially as it grows. And that is kind of a challenge, but also an opportunity, because I think there is a way that we can present this information so that it is digestible and so that we can kind of better utilize this beyond just looking at how many times an article has been cited to how something has been cited. So if you look at the same article under the lens of CITE, and I'll just give a plug here, I think the best way to experience CITE is through our plugin, so you don't have to come to CITE and search everything. This information will follow you anywhere you're reading a scientific article online. If you come over to CITE, you can see there's no real kind of innovation up top. We're showing the title, the authors, and then a link to the version of record. And then what is different is that we show not just a list of citing titles, but we also show the context. And so this little snippet of text here, these 3 sentences, is taken from the full text article. And this one is classified as supporting. And you can see why it's classified as supporting, because it says, in agreement with previous work, and then there's a citation in Nicholson et al., the trisomic clone showed similar aberrations, albeit to a lesser extent, supplemental figure S to B. And so this, you know, in a few clicks, and really without having read the paper, you can see that there is independent support of this, and you can read this. And so we are, you know, really kind of our focus is, yes, there is a lot of AI that goes into this, but establishing kind of the UI, so the user interface, to build trust. So being able to see the context, being able to see the confidence in the number, and then being able to flag it. So next to each classification, you can click this and say, hey, this is actually disputing or mentioning, and then that's reviewed by 2 independent experts. And so how does this, you know, apply beyond just kind of looking at individual articles, and how does this apply to us today? And so, as we all know, we're in a pandemic, and with that is a massive surge of publications on COVID-19. a lot of these are coming through preprints, and so this is looking at a cumulative amount of preprints even only up until to August 16th, and so there's actually probably quite a bit more. And these are coming out in sources where there's not even, citation numbers or peer review happened. And so this kind of consequence of this is that, a lot of confusion, I would say, around what is being dispersed and what can we trust and what can we not trust. So how does Cite, help here? And so if you look at this article from medRxiv, it's looking at the presence of SARS-CoV-2 reactive T cells in COVID-19 patients and healthy donors. Has this been tested? Has it been cited? Has it been disputed? Has it even been, commented on or peer reviewed? And so if you look at this under the metrics section, you might see altmetrics, and you can show that this has been widely spread. So there's 57 news outlets, 12 blogs, and then, thousands of tweets and shared on Facebook and different videos. And so it's had a large impact, but is it something that we can trust? Is it something that other researchers dispute or that they support? And so again, looking through this through the lens of Cite, and this is a different way that you can view citations on Cite through these visual networks, you can see that it does have 7 supporting citation statements. And if you click, this Curie-Cervantes paper, you can see that it says, consistent with the recent case reports, and we observed increased activation of both memory CD4 positive and CD8 positive T cells in severe. And so this is just really kind of an easy way to unlock this massive amount of information that is locked within full text publications. Well, what about beyond kind of scientific articles? So science, I think is obviously crucial to informing, not just cancer research or policy or pandemics, but also, how we interact with it as non-scientists as well. And so we did this study recently where we looked at references in Wikipedia to see how have they been cited. Are there any that have been retracted? Are there any that have been strongly disputed? Or are they generally supported? And are they more cited than non-referenced articles? And so looking at this is one example of the suicide in the internet Wikipedia page, which I think doesn't take any explanation to say that it can be quite meaningful looking at this page. And so if you look at this, there's roughly 7 references here. And this first one is saying, a survey has found that suicide risk individuals who went online for suicide-related purposes compared with online users who did not reported greater suicide risk symptoms, were less likely to seek help, and perceived less social support. So if you're reading this with these tendencies, or you have a loved one that may have these tendencies, this could have a meaningful impact on how you actually act upon it. And so number 1, let's hope, is right. And so if you click through to number 1, you'll see again, there's a number of citations. Surprisingly, there's not even that many views. And so, despite Wikipedia being such a highly trafficked page, I'm guessing that people are not actually clicking the references. And then there's this altmetric score. And so we have, again, a way of looking at kind of the impact that it's made, but not necessarily looking at the veracity of this. And so if you look at this, and I'll kind of just skip ahead, if you look at this through the lens of Cite, you can see that it does have some supporting citations. But interestingly enough, these supporting citations come from the same lab. And you can also see that there's a disputing citation. And the disputing citation isn't worded that this is a horrible study and it should be removed. It's really just saying, hey, we found something different, and here's, a context to this. And so if you open up that paper, and that is an intent of Cite, is not to replace actually reading the full text article, which I think is still the best way to evaluate an article, you can see that their findings, suggest that those who actually have suicide or self-harm related internet use were actually more likely to have sought professional help. And so this is the opposite conclusion that is being shared on Wikipedia. And I think that, comes from this kind of ability to look at different citations. And I think, we've made this badge now freely available. We want this to help people, deal with this information overload. And so as you all know, and as many people have said more eloquently in their talks before, citations are not just applying to individual articles, but they're also looking at journals, at people, at institutions. And so we've done some kind of brief analyses looking at, okay, well, how does Cite look at the journal level? How does it look at the personal level and the individual level? And so this is a graph looking at what we call a Cite index. So this is really just a simple ratio of the number of supporting citations over the total number of testing citations at the journal level. And you can look at this in 2-year windows, 5-year windows, and you can openly explore this at cite.ai/journals. And what we did was to compare this Cite index to the impact factor. And what we saw was that there was no relationship here. What we also did was started to look at this across fields. So again, this is, on the left is looking at the CITE index across all the journals that we looked at here, and then we broke them down into different categories. And the ones with the most support, which is maybe not surprising, and maybe a bit of a validation to what we do, is that math journals. So there's only so many ways you can kind of dispute math, and so there's a high amount of supporting citations within mathematics, similarly in physical, chemical, and earth sciences, and then as you get down where there's more debate, and I think debate is a good thing, this happens in clinical research as well as social sciences. And I think this is types of studies, need to be done more in depth. And so one thing that I would love to kind of, plug here again is that we're happy to make this data openly available to researchers and librarians so that they can answer these questions and kind of extend their studies using our data. And I would say our data is pretty unique, despite, these other citation indices having been around much longer than us. And so how do we do it? So this is, maybe on everyone's mind. Well, the short answer is there's a lot of machine learning to do this. The longer answer is that we take full text publications from publishers or open sources, and then we utilize machine learning to identify the in-text citation, match it to the reference section, and then match that reference section against cross-ref data. And so that is easy if you have JATS XML, which publishers do up until a point. But most publications are still in PDFs, and it can be quite challenging given all the different citation styles, PDF styles, reference styles, et cetera. And so there is 11 machine learning models with 20 to 30 different features each used to extract the citation information and the sentence around it. Once we have that context and that citation matched, we have a deep learning model that classifies the citation statement, and that's important to emphasize that it's a statement, as supporting, disputing, or mentioning. And the way we've built that is to read these statements as humans roughly 50,000 times and to annotate them and say, okay, the authors here indicate that they're supporting it with evidence or that they're disputing it with evidence. And I would really like to emphasize that we're not just looking at positive or negative sentiment. So it's not enough to be critical or kind of mean. Really, it's looking at the rhetorical function. Do they support it? And is there, evidence and data behind this supporting or disputing a citation statement? And so where are we today? We've been live as a website since May of last year, and we've been rapidly processing articles. And so we have, as of today, as of this morning, 715 million citation statements. These come from 21 million journal articles, and then they cite over 40 million articles. And so it's a lot, but, I believe Web of Science and Scopus are still over a billion. And so how do we get these? The challenge with what we do versus what, my other citation indices have to do is that we need access to the full text publication. And so we're working directly with publishers to gain access. And we now have actually nearly a dozen publications, indexing agreements, the largest one being with Wiley, and then others like BMJ, Carger, Future Science Group, and Cambridge University Press. And so once we have this information, and I think it's kind of robust enough, we want it to inform, how people interpret articles. And so we started to work directly with publishers to display this in the metrics section or even in the reference section. So here's an example of our badge live on Biotechniques. It's also live on Rockefeller University Press journals, and we'll be live on 104 journals on Wiley soon. And then you can also display this in the reference section. And so really kind of, anywhere there's scientific information or a title for a scientific article, we think that can be valuable to look at this and quickly see how has it been cited, not just how many times has it been cited. This is maybe going to be better addressed on the next talk, but this information doesn't have to be utilized only on published articles, but it can also be utilized at the submission stage. And so we've come up with this reference check. And this reference check allows authors to upload their manuscripts to check their references to see if they are retracted, corrected, highly disputed, or more generally to see how others have cited this. And so we've just tied this system in to Manuscript Manager and Editorial Manager to tie it directly into submission systems to help editors, peer reviewers, and authors make sure that the references that they're using in their manuscripts are what they believe them to be. And we can now, with pretty complete retraction data, we can now reliably also identify the problems that journals have, saying, okay, you guys are continually publishing things that are citing retracted work. and not doing so, not acknowledging that, so not being aware of that. And so this has just gone live really last week, and I think, there's a lot of learning here to be done, because in this example, yes, it's been retracted and that one should be removed, but oftentimes there can be, this debate. And so it's not as clear as this one has a disputing cite, it should be removed, and this one has supporting cite, it should be kept, but really, unlocking this kind of context around research. And so I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge kind of Eugene Garfield and the fact that, he had this idea a lot earlier than I. And so this paper from 1964 by Eugene Garfield called Can Citation Indexing Be Automated actually talks about citation markers. And so he says these markers would appear in the published citation index along the usual citation data. And in the case of the example above, he gives a critique, or Mr. X is wrong, or my favorite, calamity for mankind. And he even says the intelligent machine would examine a new document and generate a critical statement such as a rather poor paper. So I really kind of see what we're doing, as an extension of this, and really kind of parallels what lawyers have done for over 100 years by shepherdizing their articles and looking at, how something has been cited and if it's reliable, not just based if it's impactful. So with that, I would like to say thanks. There's my email, so I'd be happy to, work with anyone here. We can create custom dashboards based on universities and things like this. And then there's our Twitter accounts. And then also, because this is the NIH, we are primarily funded by a fast track grant from NIDA. And so I think that's been critical because, building what we're building is not easy and it's not cheap, but I think it's, very important. And so happy to take any questions that anyone may have. And also, again, any other time.
Thank you so much, Josh. There are lively discussions on the chat right now, but interestingly, you have covered all of them in your talk. Okay, so there's only one question left. When you're doing this kind of analysis, did you consider citation error? So say, for example, when the statement says that they are supporting something, but actually that article doesn't really support that. Did you consider this kind of error?
Yeah, so we do, and we don't do anything to help that. And so there's this blog post in Science that's called Nonsense Lives in the Citations, and it gives examples where there's prominent articles that are highly cited, and they're always highly cited mostly for the wrong reason. And so it's easy to see that problem with cite because you can now quickly look at the context, but we are not flagging that. And that is a large issue. The other kind of issue, which I think is, again, easier to see with cite, is citation bias, right? And so most citations, and this parallels to what Misha said, are just mentioning under our system. About 94% of them, in fact. About 5% of them are supporting, and then really less than 1% of them are disputing. And we hope that by having explicit measures, people will become more clear in supporting or disputing papers, and maybe people will actually start to dispute more because there's a real reason to do it as opposed to just kind of writing it off into the void.
Mm-hmm. And do you factor in self-cite?
We are working on that now, and I think that'll be really fascinating because anecdotally, I think I feel a lot more confident when I see someone refute their earlier work. It gives me, more trust in that individual, and maybe less so when I see someone just repeatedly supporting their work. Maybe excessively. And so we're working on that now. At the individual article level, we'll have self-cites and then also shared author cites. And then I think this can also be interesting to look at the journal level as well. And so these are forthcoming.
Great. Thank you so much. I think that's all.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Josh. That was a great presentation. So our final presenter in this set of talks is going to be Jodi Schneider from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign to talk about the problems of post-retraction citation. So, Jodi?
Thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here at this symposium. Been really enjoying the past several days, and it's great to be following Misha and Josh. Let me get up my slides here. All right. So hopefully you can see I'm talking today about the problems of post-retraction citations and some mitigation strategies that work. So first off, I want to tell you the perspective I'm coming from, not only as a faculty member at iSchool who's teaching future librarians, future information managers, but also someone who's engaged in things that bias the way that I'm coming from, both talking to other folks in industry and working on NIH projects, and very much looking forward to a project that I'm organizing and talking with stakeholders about retracted science, including folks who are very engaged in making the situation better, like Ivan Arensky of Retraction Watch and Josh, who we just heard from about scite. So retraction, many of you know, is a mechanism for correcting the literature, and it's meant to only be used when the findings and conclusions are no longer considered reliable. The COPE Council, which you can look at publicationethics.org, says that prompt retraction should minimize the number of researchers who cite the erroneous work, act on its findings, or draw incorrect conclusions, such as from double counting redundant publications. And people in meta-analyses and systematic reviews are often really paying attention to this, but many researchers are not. And so the first problem that I want to point out is that retracted papers get cited and used. I estimate that 800,000 articles directly cite a retracted paper. That's on the basis of having 19,000 retracted papers listed in Retraction Watch. Of those, you can find almost 8,000 in PubMed. I'll show you how to do that search later. And the work that my students and I have done finds that 94% of the papers in PubMed have received at least, that are retracted, have received at least one citation, and on average 35 citations. So these things have been used, and I'll talk later about how even post the retraction, they are still getting cited. Of course, using retracted paper citation is not the only thing, as we've seen in many ways of the past couple of days, but use of retracted papers is also problematic. NPR had a story in March about a retracted study from China that was used in defending the coronavirus testing strategy. So this is also something that we, once we've found that research is unreliable, we don't want to use it. However, it's hard in many cases to figure out that something is retracted. Here's an example. This paper I've been working on for a while. This paper was published in 2005. It's actually a randomized control trial. It was retracted. There is, from the publisher's site, no way to figure out that it was retracted. There's no watermark. There's, in the PDF, in the HTML, anything. If you go to databases, you can see that it's retracted, but and I can show you right here. Here's the retraction notice. In fact, it was retracted 3 years after it was published because one of the authors falsified data. So it's something we don't want to use. However, getting to that retraction notice is really challenging. I tested 9 different records in 8 different databases. And from Embase, you could, the link to the retraction notice worked. In other cases, you got any number of different errors. So for instance, the 360 link that I used from Pittsburgh took me to a chest journal error page. Generally, this page doesn't exist, right? It's just a linking problem. The metadata is such that it's hard to link to. PubMed, the last time I checked, also, great notification, lots of pink things saying it's retracted, but you can't get to the retraction notice itself either. So this, as far as I can tell, is leading to people citing retracted papers. So yes, retracted papers do often get, new retraction notices will generally get DOIs. Because DOIs are relatively recent, as of 2008, that article may not have had a DOI when it was, the retraction notice may not have had a DOI at the time. But other problems with the metadata are things like the author is not necessarily the author of the papers. And so you'll see metadata errors in linking strings that are causing problems. So when authors see that they can, this paper is just fine as far as they know, and many authors, I think, are not aware of retraction as a thing. I wasn't aware of it until a number of years ago. And so people cite retracted papers without knowing they're retracted. So this same paper, since it was retracted, it's been cited over 100 times. Now I've looked at the citing sentences, the citation context. 4% of them mention the retraction. Everybody else is using this as though it's science. It's only completed randomized control trial on the topic. There's an ongoing one that should hopefully finish soon. But right now we just have no evidence. And yet people are citing the falsified data as though it's real. So really problematic. And as far as I can tell, it's just out of not knowing. So this is what the citations per year look like. If we count everything from 2009 forward in red as post-retraction, you see that almost all of the citation is post-retraction, and almost all of it is just using this fake data as normal science. So I think there's a real problem in the systems that we have that are supporting and in awareness. So what can we do to fix this? One other problem before I get to that is that, of course, it's not just the immediate citations, but you also have a network of papers that are citing those. So as of 2008, this paper had the 32 direct citations, but then the second generation of papers that were citing those, there were, just in 2008, 63 new articles citing the ones that had cited it. But of course, that's gone up. Now there are thousands and thousands. And you see that there's just, and we've looked at the spread of misinformation in citation context going forward. And the paper that I have here has a couple examples of things that I think are misinformation spreading from people who mention the methods and results of the retracted paper, but not its retraction, and then those folks being cited and spreading that information onward to the second generation. So first, I want people to be aware of retraction, right? So as you think about things that you want active researchers who are publishing to know, we've talked about all sorts of issues of metrics and challenges of metrics and visibility. I would like retraction to be on this list of things that you move into the conversation. Retraction Watch, which has been mentioned in the chat, is a great site for keeping track, both for news and their top 10 list of most cited retracted papers that you could, make some caveats about some of those. And they have a list of the COVID-19 papers, up to 33 so far, that have been retracted. Another place to get authoritative information for at least the NIH-related cases is the Office of Research Integrity, which has misconduct case summaries. You can see in the top here, and then also research misconduct findings. Those get published also if you subscribe to weekly table of contents grant alerts from NIH. You'll see those listed as findings of research misconduct. Other things that you can do would be to search databases, as we've seen. So the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors tells people that PubMed is the authoritative search source for articles that are published in Medline index journals. And to search inside PubMed, there's a publication type, retracted publications. And you see that just about 8,000 results that come back inside PubMed. Lots of other publication types that are relevant there. You can look at the retraction notices themselves, which are indexed as retraction of publication. You can also take a look, this is from the NIH project I mentioned, one of the tools my collaborators have built, Annotate, where when you do a search from PubMed, you can click on publication types, and the first thing it will give you is these problematic types for a search. Retraction Watch has a database, which is probably the single most comprehensive source that I'm aware of, and many other databases indicate retraction status. Today, a student and I have just put in a paper on final version of a paper on indexing quality. So the one thing I would say is don't rely on just one source. You really want to look in multiple places, and please report indexing errors when you find them and call on vendors for better indexing. I think it's really important. One place that's very convenient from a user endpoint is Zotero. Last June, Zotero started flagging retracted items. This is based on having a DOI and being known as retracted in the Retraction Watch database. So it's not completely comprehensive, but it's the single best, like, user-friendly, on your, if you're integrating into your bibliography, this is a great thing to have at to hand. If you add something that's retracted, it will tell you in an alert an item in your database has been retracted, and then it'll give you a link to it. And then once you have some things that are retracted there, it will keep the list of retracted items, put this red X next to them so that hopefully you notice them, and put them in a list, do other things when you put them in a bibliography, and so on. So this is helping. Obviously, the work that Josh is talking about, integrating systems into publisher backends, is really needed, and another piece of this. So one of the things from a research perspective that I've been working on is the notion of how do we flag problematic citations, right? So the things that have already been published, maybe post-retraction, like the case I told you about, or maybe before the thing got retracted. How do you tell whether a paper needs to be corrected or retracted based on that, right? If it's a systematic review where everything, if the retracted paper is something that was synthesized, then you have to correct it because you're depending on something that's, in this really essential way. But we have a notion of looking at the argument of a paper and coming up with a list of screening questions so that you can identify where the significant, meaningful, impactful citations are, and then flag the articles that are potentially impacted. There's a whole paper on that you can read if this sounds interesting. I'm very happy to talk more about that. I mentioned at the beginning, I'm running a workshop. This is a whole stakeholder consultation. We're taking up empirical literature on retraction to try to understand what's known, interviewing folks. We've interviewed, I think, about 35 people so far, and we're running a workshop in 3 parts this fall, talking to people across different parts of the scholarly ecosystem about retraction. What can we do to stop citing and stop using it? So I'm very happy to talk further. If anybody is interested, feel free to reach out. So Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Jodi. We actually have some questions here, especially regarding how you see retracted papers being used in evaluation. So do you see that counting retracted papers being used in evaluation? There might be some concerns about it unfairly punishing co-authors that are not part of the data fraud or other things that leads to the retractions.
I think this is a great question, and it's something that I don't think anyone has a complete answer to. One of the big concerns in the literature is the impact on co-authors' careers when they publish something that's retracted, but that it was, maybe, seen as someone else's fault. And I think you can look at this in, from a couple perspectives. One is that if retraction is just meant to correct the literature, then we ought to be rewarding people for correcting their mistakes when it's, something that you find an error and you say, oh, actually, it's something else. Another perspective you can look, because, some, significant amount of retraction is misconduct related, that there are certainly pressures to publish more and to co-author more and so on and so forth, but there isn't necessarily a pressure to validate what you're publishing. And so some journals will have, sort of notion of a guarantor, and, should everyone on the paper be just as responsible for the content, and are there situations when that's reasonable or not? I think some of that is fairly domain specific in terms of what makes sense, but unduly penalizing people is problematic. But then, there are multiple ways to look at it.
Great. I don't think I see other questions in the chat. Oh, yes, sorry, one more. How do you think about your work related to how computational social scientists study mis- and disinformation on social media platforms? Do you see overlap in the methods or strategies used across these two domains?
Often when I'm describing this work to students, I'm talking about it as the fake news of science, and I think there definitely is overlap there. In terms of the methods, there's a lot of computational work that you do. I mean, data cleaning work, R, visualization that would go into no matter what it is that you're mining, whether it's papers and or tweets or whatever kind of social media that you're looking at.
One more question. Have you studied retracted papers that are picked up by news media?
Not very much, but what I can say is that media dissemination seems to really impact people's awareness of retraction. It seems to reduce citation much more than other things.
Now I think that's all from me. Thank you.
Thanks, Yelling.
All right. Thanks again, Jodi. And thanks once again to all of our speakers for today's panel session. So that, again, concludes our session for the moment. So we're going to take another 15-minute break or so, and we'll reconvene at 45 minutes past the hour for a training session on the Scopus database. Thanks, everyone.